Are you loving the Yellowstone spin-off, 1923, that chronicles the adventures of the powerful and wealthy Dutton family? Montana landowners and cattle ranchers who will do anything to hold on to their empire. Ever wonder who were the strong and brave women from history who ranched right alongside their male counterparts during the age of the cattle kings? Well, you don't have to wonder any longer. Being the history buff that I am, I rooted around the web and found some very interesting women who built ranches, drove cattle, and endured the hardships of the Wild West. With most of them hailing from the cattle ranches of Texas, many of the women were dubbed, as you might have guessed, Texas cattle queens. As I tell the stories of these cattle queens, see if you can name which one more closely resembles Cara Dutton of the show, 1923. And while you're at it, why not leave your thoughts in the comments below? Let's start with Elizabeth Lizzie Johnson Williams. This cattle queen of Texas, born in 1840, wasn't born in Texas, but grew up there in the midst of the meteoric rise of the Texas cattle barons making their fortunes owning and operating large cattle ranches in the state. While working as a bookkeeper for prominent cattlemen and investors in the area, including George W. Littlefield, William H. Day, and Charles W. Whitus, Lizzie soon realized that there was a great deal of money to be made in the cattle industry and wasted no time registering her own cattle brand, as well as promptly purchasing ranch land in Hays County, Texas. All of this happened before she married Hezekiah Williams in 1879, at which time Lizzie, who was shrewd enough to know that she had to have a prenuptial contract that allowed her to keep her land, cattle, and financial affairs in her own name and under her own control, did just that. And while much of the land bought after her marriage was done in her husband's name, she is said to have had a dominating influence over their combined cattle operations. More than that, she was the first documented woman to ride the Chisholm Trail with her cattle under her own brand, independent of her husband's brand. They may have rode the trail and their herds together, but Lizzie Williams is said to be credited with amassing a fortune of over $250,000, $4 million in today's money at the time of her death. But Lizzie's story doesn't end there. After the death of her husband in 1914, she became a reclusive figure, known as the miserly, penniless cattle queen residing in an apartment in Austin, all while secretly hoarding a fortune in diamonds. The irony of her situation is quite striking, as she had made a great fortune in the cattle industry and ended up living like a miser. Next, we have Alice Littlefield. Alice and her husband, ex-Confederate officer George Littlefield, represent what the successful and perhaps lucky rancher could achieve in the post-Civil War era in Gonzales, Texas in 1869. They began as farmers, but farming was turning out to be a struggle, only earning about $150 per year. The good news is that the Littlefield circumstances changed dramatically after they became involved in cattle ranching. For Mrs. Littlefield, who came from a southern plantation and was accustomed to rural life, becoming a frontier woman may not have represented that big of a change, but hardship did follow her in the way of losing 2 children, both of whom died in infancy. Starting in the early 1870s, Littlefield drove cattle to Kansas railheads and expanded his enterprise. Over the years, he had several ranches throughout Texas, and at one time, his cattle grazed over an area of eastern New Mexico, the size of the state of Rhode Island. Life on a cattle ranch was often isolated and remote for the women left behind during the cattle drive. Alice had to be self-sufficient and able to handle any situation that arose while being responsible for keeping the house and grounds in order, managing the garden and orchard, and taking care of the animals. As the Littlefields transitioned from farmers to successful ranchers, life seemed to be getting better for Alice. By the 1880s, she and her husband, George, had moved to Austin, where he prospered as a banker and business owner. But despite this success, the years of solitude and isolation on the cattle ranch had taken a toll on Alice. In 1912, at around the age of 65, she developed an unexplained nervous condition marked by a delusional fear that her whole household would be murdered, and she would be kidnapped. After George Littlefield died of pneumonia in 1920, Alice's nervous condition suddenly and unexpectedly improved. Now that her husband's safety was no longer a concern, She regained normal mental health and resumed an active social life until her death on January 9, 1935, at age 88. Third on our list is Mary Ann Goodnight, most often called Molly. She was the wife of famed cattle baron Charles Goodnight, who, by the way, was introduced as a real-life historical character on the Yellowstone prequel, 1883, in episodes 7 and 8. Molly Goodnight is possibly one of the most famous historic Texas women. She eventually earned a reputation as the mother of the Panhandle for her kindness and charitable works. Along with her husband and others, Molly drove a herd of cattle to the Palo Duro Canyon to help establish the now famous J.A. Ranch. In Lewis Atherton's Cattle Kings, the author notes that ranchers often chose a spouse who shared their individualist mentality. The reason for this is because many ranchers were themselves strong-willed individuals who sought out the solitude and independence that came with ranching. Charles Goodnight, a successful rancher in Texas, is cited as an example. Goodnight initially established a ranch in Colorado and didn't marry until after the ranch was running smoothly, and then he chose a wife that was an adventurous woman who loved the pioneer lifestyle. Molly spent her time as a rancher's wife, mending the clothes of cowboys and running a simple, non-luxurious household. Despite the difficulties of remote living, she didn't shy away from the challenges and embraced the frontier lifestyle. The future was uncertain, but the hope was that after a few years of hard work, prosperity would come and life would be better. This risk-taking nature was something that many ranchers looked for in a spouse. The success of a rancher had a direct impact on what his wife had to endure. Wives of more successful ranchers had servants to help with chores, but for others, life could be harsh. Cooking, sewing, fetching water for washing, and even assisting with regular cowboy duties were common responsibilities. It was a life of voluntary sacrifice, but with the hope of a better future. Beyond her regular chores, Molly even went so far as to rescue baby bison left behind by hunters, soon establishing the Goodnight buffalo herd, one of the earliest herds of domesticated buffalo and one of the oldest now in existence, thanks to her compassionate and dedicated efforts. Goodnight grew his wealth when he created the Goodnight Loving Trail, which was a cattle drive established in the late 1860s for the movement of large herds of Texas Longhorns from Texas to Wyoming. The ranching couple continued to flourish with over 100,000 head of cattle at one point. They went on to build a spacious Victorian-style two-story ranch house, now famously known as the Goodnight Ranch House, in Goodnight, Texas. In 1991, Molly was inducted in the National Cowgirl Museum and Hall of Fame. Fourth, we have Margaret Boland, the first female trail boss. In the mid-19th century, Texas saw a boom in cattle ranching, but few women were among the ranchers. One exception was Margaret Borland. She drove a herd of 1,000 Texas Longhorn cattle up the Chisholm Trail from the south of Texas to Wichita, Kansas, with 4 young children in tow. Born in New York City in 1824, Margaret's family settled in the prairies of San Patricio in Texas, where her father became a successful rancher. During the Texas Revolution, the family had to flee to Goliad Fort for safety, passing as Mexican children. After the war, Margaret married Harrison Dunbar, but he was killed in a duel, leaving her a widow and single mother at 20. She remarried twice, had 7 children, and with her third husband Alexander Borland, built one of the largest ranches on the Texas coast. After his death, Margaret doggedly continued on to run the ranch on her own. She hired more hands to do the physical labor, while she participated in the cattle business, buying and selling livestock, and increasing her herd to 10,000 head. In the early spring of 1873, Margaret faced a decision as to where to sell her 1,000 head of cattle. With the San Antonio market offering $8 per head and Kansas paying $23.80, she made the decision to drive the cattle up the Chisholm Trail to Kansas. At least 4 women in history have been designated cattle queens, but they were accompanied on the trail by their husbands. Margaret Borland was the only woman to run her own cattle drive from Texas to Kansas. After successfully reaching Wichita, Kansas, Margaret was suddenly consumed by an illness known as trail fever. She died July 5, 1873, at the age of 49, and her body was returned to Texas for burial. She left no diary or letters to tell us more about her life, but she became a legend up and down the Chisholm Trail. Which of these Texas cattle queens do you think might be a good representation of Cara Dutton in Yellowstone's 1923 series on Paramount? We're all dying to know, so be sure to let your thoughts be known in the comments. And while you are at it, why not check out another great history video right here?